Two big beasts on the international scene are squaring up. The European Union accuses China of human rights abuses. China says it's none of your business, and each has imposed sanctions on the other. At risk is a massive trade deal between the two, jobs and billions of dollars at stake. Is either side prepared to back down? This is Roundtable. Hello and welcome to the programme from me, David Foster. In this programme, we will talk to one of those in the European Union who's been picked out for sanctions by China. And we'll ask if all this is merely posturing. Can they really afford to exist in isolation? Relations between the European Union and China seem to be at their best at the end of 2020, when the two finalised negotiations on a wide-ranging investment deal. But in March of this year, all 27 EU nations announced sanctions on Chinese officials over their alleged role in human rights abuses towards the Uyghur Muslim minority in China's Xinjiang region. These were the first human rights-specific sanctions the EU has levied on China since the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. The European Union measures were meant to be symbolic, but China quickly retaliated with its own sanctions, blacklisting a number of EU parliamentarians and other political targets. China and the EU are the world's two largest trading partners, with daily trade averaging over $1 billion. But the investment deal is now on hold, with tit-for-tat sanctions, and tensions are at an all-time high. Many European Union politicians have stated that removal of sanctions is a precondition to resuming trade talks with China. Billions of dollars and a massive trade deal are at risk. So will relations be repaired? Well, I'm delighted to be able to say that for this roundtable, we can cross first of all to Vilnius, Lithuania, talk to one of the country's MPs there, Dovile Sakaliene, who's one of the 10 EU politicians blacklisted by China. In London, we say hello once again to Stephen Chan, Professor of World Politics at SOAS University, and also in the UK capital, Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Dovile, let me come to you first of all. You've campaigned for human rights for a very long time. What is it you've said about what's happening in China that has so upset the authorities there that they've blacklisted you?
Well, I suppose I've said a lot of things, and probably the initiative regarding resolution on recognition that there is a genocide actually happening against Uyghurs, and that we would demand also that international independent investigation into those atrocities would be initiated immediately. And it was supported by two committees in my parliament, my own committee on national security and defense and committee on foreign affairs supported this initiative. And right after that, the attention, became even more intense. But I've been working with IPAC, International Parliamentary Alliance on China, since its establishment. I'm one of the co-founders and co-chairs, and I think we've been doing quite a lot in that area, so that human rights, fundamental rights and freedoms have been taking up more and more space in agenda of most Western states.
Can you help our viewers who haven't followed this very closely to understand what you and others say is happening in Xinjiang province to the Uyghurs?
Well, it's not that, what we are saying, but we are reacting to a lot of open sources and some disclosures from within the regime that there is a lot of systematic, grave human rights violations happening there. And what China seems to be calling re-education camps, all decorated with barbed wire and containing there probably around 1 million Uyghurs, is definitely not re-education. That's definitely reminding me a lot to what we've been enduring when we were occupied by Soviet regime, Gulag system, and this so-called re-education camp system seems extremely similar. And what we've seeing, for example, when we read investigations by, for example, 2020, we've seen investigation by Global Policy Center saying that over 500,000 Uyghurs have been used for forced labor in cotton fields. When we see investigations again of 2020 by Jamestown Foundation that the forced sterilization of Uyghur women has actually dropped the rates of birth of Uyghurs in 3 years by 84%, or when we see another
and the list
etc.
is a very, very long one, Dovile. We don't have time to go into it here, but you've catalogued what many people fear are massive human rights abuses. I'm going to ask you towards the end of the program to tell me what effect sanctions might have on you, might already have had on you and your family. But Isabel, let me come to you at this point. President Xi telephoned Angela Merkel the other day and effectively said, do not get too close to the United States on all of this. Well, what is it that China appears to be frightened of?
Well, China is concerned that the EU and the United States will, as it were, gang up on China. They had a pretty free run during the Trump administration because President Trump managed to alienate most of the United States' traditional allies and really took a position that was sufficiently extreme that the EU was very reluctant to follow him there. But we have a different American president, one that talks about shared values in a way that obviously Trump did not. And that appeals to European leaders. It appeals to European public opinion also, which is extremely negative on China. And so China, if you look at China's position towards the end of last year, it was very concerned that the overtures that the United States was making to Europe wouldn't result in a kind of united front against China. What is really puzzling, however, is that given that they were relatively successful in that, and they had managed to close, for example, the negotiations on the comprehensive investment agreement that they had been negotiating for 7 years, that just in the last few weeks, China's very aggressive diplomatic actions have pretty much driven Europe into the arms of the United States in a way that I feel is quite counterproductive to China's interests and intentions.
Can I ask you this? As a journalist, I've been reading and reporting on what's been happening in Xinjiang for a number of years now. You talk about how close China and the European Union came towards the end of last year. So why now, when this persecution has apparently been going on for a very, very long time, why is the EU taking a stance at this point?
Well, I think that the evidence has been accumulating, and you know, Xinjiang is obviously very important. From the British perspective, Hong Kong is also extremely important, and certainly China has been stepping up its actions. I mean, the initial sanctions on Xinjiang began with the United States, began with the Biden administration, and the EU and the UK, you know, supported them. So I think that these things have been coming to a head. But I have
is it because they've suddenly got a big friend in the White House, whereas before they didn't?
Well, certainly it helps. Yeah, of course. I mean, if you are thinking of imposing sanctions on China and you have someone in the White House who does not support human rights advocacy, then clearly the European Union is more exposed. So yes, solidarity matters in these things, and it's still not enough, for example, to carry a vote in the United Nations General Assembly, where China has pretty much, you know, got the majority of votes on its side through trade relations, through political pressure, through any number of for any number of reasons.
And indeed, if it were at the Security Council, China has the right of veto. Okay, so I understand that area there. Stephen, let me read out something from China's foreign ministry. Same day that the European Union said it was imposing sanctions, the foreign ministry said the EU must stop lecturing others on human rights and interfering in their internal affairs. It must end the hypocritical practice of double standards and stop going further down the wrong path. Otherwise, China will resolutely make further reactions. Two questions for you there. First of all, what further reactions could we possibly see from China, or is it blustering? And what does it accuse the EU of being hypocritical about?
I think right now we're still in a stage of largely economic sanctions that are meant to provide some cost to the recipient. No one's actually launching sanctions that can actually change policy, but to indicate that policies do have a cost and that the other side should think again. So we're probably going to see an escalation on both sides of that kind of sanction. In terms of what the Chinese mean when they say double standards, there's a long memory in China, and they're thinking back to what they refer to as the century of humiliation, when Western powers basically imperialized a huge part of China, all of the main cities, for instance. The whole question of Hong Kong is a residue of precisely that. And so the Chinese bring that past into their current perceptions and into their current foreign policy. Basically, they would regard this as a moment of assertion, that they think they're on the rise. They think they're going to rise higher and faster than European and other Western nations. And this is the flexing of muscles. I can see it only as a flexing of muscle.
So do you think it's posturing on behalf of both sides, that if it ever came to it, that they would both back down because they both need each other so much?
Right now, I think that's a question of posturing on both sides, obviously trying to levy cost one side against the other. I doubt whether or not the sanctions will escalate to the point where there is serious cost. In other words, the world is globalized enough that each needs the other. So at some point in time, some kind of serious discussion, probably behind the scenes, is going to have to take place. What you do have, apart from a very bellicose and a very strident President Xi, are very sophisticated people in the Chinese establishment. The foreign minister, Wang Yi, for instance, is a very sophisticated person. Whether or not some, as it were, middle path can be crafted in the midst of rising, as it were, tensions, and escalating rhetoric, that remains to be seen. Right now, however, I don't think we're going to see the end of slow motion but very perceptible escalation of rhetoric and of economic sanctions for some little time to come.
Okay, to some extent, therefore, perhaps shouting from the shadows. Dovile, I'm going to put a little chart up on the screen now that illustrates how dependent the European Union and China are on one another when it comes to business. This is from Eurostat. In 2020, China was the third largest market in terms of volume for European Union. Exports, 10.5% of everything that the EU exported went to China. The US and the UK were more important markets in that respect, but the gap is narrowing. And in 2020, it was the largest for EU imports, 22.4%, getting pretty close to 1/4. And the USA, well, it had almost half of that. So my question to you, Dovile, is these blocks matter to one another. As a nation, China matters to the EU as much as the EU matters to China. So do you think the solidarity that you've been seeing in recent weeks could fracture?
Actually, I see that solidarity is getting stronger than ever. And especially after what happened is that China made this unprecedented move for sanctioning individuals and entities for protection of human rights. That's unprecedented because usually sanctions are applied for violations of human rights. What they did is they sanctioned parliamentarians. So I would say that this is beyond economic sanctions.
No. Let's be real about this, because when it comes to billions of dollars, when it comes to hundreds of thousands of jobs, the fact that they've put sanctions on you and 10 other, or is it 10 in all, EU, European politicians really isn't going to matter a jot if all of that's going to go down the drain.
Well, I would say that if you see the changing political rhetorics, it does matter. And since the Chinese are expanding the sanctions list, so what we see is a very big helping hand for Europe and America to unite. And as you say that, these markets are important both to each other. If we are talking about certain national states, for Lithuania, Chinese market is not that important. And when we are talking about 2020, that was an exceptional year because we are talking about COVID pandemics. But what we've seen about so-called humanitarian diplomacy also turned the European Union to diversify their makings of the surgical needs, like the mask, the certain medical equipment, and etc. We also are learning our lesson, and diversification of suppliers of certain supplies is also going on. So yes, probably we would need to have certain conversation.
I hear your point of view, and Isabel, I'm going to ask you: will the solidarity last in the wake of economic reality?
Well, we'll see, but I agree that we have more solidarity now than we have in the past, and that solidarity is being reinforced by universally negative public opinion, which I mentioned before. I've never seen China so unpopular in Europe as it is now. That's partly the pandemic, which hasn't helped, but a lot of it is wolf warrior diplomacy, plus an increasing unease about the purposes of Chinese investment. So if you look at the trade, which of course is very important, and the EU is China's biggest trading partner, but there is pretty much one country with a positive trade balance with China, and that is Germany. And so China trade and access to the China market is hugely important to Germany. And that partly explains why Angela Merkel was so very keen to get the investment agreement signed in the last days of her presidency. But other countries have a trading relationship with China in which the balance is largely against them. So it's actually more in China's interest to keep that going than it often is in the other trading nations. And
do you think again, sorry to butt in, but do you think China did this for a domestic market? It was trying to look tough for its own people rather than internationally.
I absolutely think that, and I think that that's what is dangerous. This regime plays up very much the China as victim story. The 100 years of humiliation has been a trope since 1989, since Tiananmen. This has been the story that the party tells the people, because the party constantly has to answer the question, why should the Communist Party hold power forever in China? What's its justification? And for many years it was rising economic benefit. People got richer, people had jobs, they urbanized. But that is slowing down now. So there has to be another story, and that story is hypernationalism. So we see these overreactions constantly in Chinese diplomacy, in other countries, extremely counterproductive. And we see playing to the gallery at home, which narrows the space, narrows the room for maneuver that the Chinese government has to back off on any of these issues. So we're getting locked into confrontations that are, beginning to look quite dangerous.
Stephen, let me ask you this. If the EU in the end ratifies this common investment agreement, which is in danger at the moment, if the EU and China become closer because of that, what is the United States going to make of it? And therefore, is it relishing this spat because it might mean that the European Union regards the United States as a great place to go and buy goods and sell goods rather than China?
I think that in the United States, the Biden administration is actually still feeling its way forward as to how to deal with China. They've come out rhetorically and certainly have launched measures against China. How far they're prepared to go, and whether they would go that far to jeopardize their own recovery from COVID is another question. I still see this very, very much as a bouncing backwards and forwards of things with an economic impact, but not beyond a certain point of seriousness. Now, I do think, I wish to maintain my earlier point that China is flexing its muscles right now externally. It's not just for internal consumption. There seems to be a real sea change in President Xi's approach to the world. This is seen very, very profoundly in Asia itself in terms of claims over surrounding territories. It's seen very, very much in terms of the very hard line against Hong Kong. All of this basically speaks to a looking outwards in which the Chinese are trying to recraft international relations on their own terms. I don't see any ending of this in the short term. There may be restraint because both sides do need each other. So to that extent, both sides are still feeling their way forward. But the Chinese know they're unpopular. But having begun these, and I think they are absolutely dreadful policies against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, they're not going to stop. And
so these sanctions, these EU sanctions, will not make one bit of difference to what the Chinese government decides to do with regard to these human rights abuses, as documented, as referred to as genocide, both by Dovile and by the United States and by countless other people. It will not make one bit of difference?
It will not make any difference. I hate to be so pessimistic and negative about this. I know there are many brave people. Among those individuals who've been sanctioned by the Chinese are some of my own friends and neighbors. So I understand what they're going through. And a number of us as overseas Chinese have been warned in not uncertain terms that we risk being put on all kinds of blacklists, for instance. So they're not going to back down at this moment in time. The big question is how far forward will they take their external bellicose attitude?
Okay, we'll have to wait and see. Dovile, I am going to come back to you to help me wrap up the program in just a minute. But Isabel, I want to ask you to reflect on what you've heard from Stephen. Think for us, where does it go from here?
I agree with a lot of what Stephen says. The only way that I can see sanctions or external pressure having an effect on Chinese policy is if China, as if there are perceptions in the elite that Xi Jinping has gone too far. I think that's not unlikely. I think there are a lot of people in China who are pretty uncomfortable with the direction that China is taking. But the only thing that is going to change China's policy is elite pressure. It's pressure within the higher levels of the political system to modify any policy, and that will never be admitted to be a result of external pressure. But external pressure does count. China wouldn't overreact in the way it has if it didn't care about shutting down criticism. It's sanctioned Merrick's a very respectable German think tank on China because it has an independent and critical outlook. It's sanctioned people who have supported. There's a UK barristers' chambers which has supported legal work on human rights. It's trying to close down all of these critical voices because they matter.
Isabel, sorry, time is my enemy. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Isabel, but Dovile, I wanted to come to you. You tweeted not so very long ago, human rights are not for sale, so we're not backing down, #China. What difficulties do these sanctions present for you on a personal basis, and are they worth it?
Well, for example, my husband is a diplomat, and all these sanctions apply also to the family members of those sanctions. So not only for innocent people, but for people who are not even working with these issues. And as a diplomat, he can't enter China in the foreseeable future. So that only shows that we are right about this totalitarian regime becoming more and more aggressive. But I would like to note two important things. You are talking about economical gain. We have to understand that by looking closer at that economical gain, we see a mousetrap, a very, very dangerous mousetrap. And another mousetrap is security issues related to technological advances. So what we really need to think about is, are we really benefiting from economic and technological issues offered by China? Because basically,
and if we are, is that worth it? I mean, would you be prepared then to say, well, you can do what you like to the Uyghurs? Because Stephen and Isabel don't seem to think that this kind of pressure is going to make much difference. But if the economical and technological benefits are that great, do you just ignore what's happening?
I am saying to you openly, there are no benefits. It's a mousetrap. There are no economical benefits. These are liabilities for us in security and economical matters. Our Minister of Foreign Affairs openly said There are almost no benefits. It's just a big security risk.
But it might not make any difference. The Chinese might just carry on.
Still, we have to fight for what is right, because democracy and human rights protection are the values that Western civilization holds dear, and I see that this is taking more and more space in our agenda. If we cannot change something today, it doesn't mean that drop by drop we won't change it in the future. We cannot apply double standards. Human torture, human suffering is just as important if it's happening here or 5,000 miles beyond.
Listen, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. That's Dovile Sakaliene talking to us from Vilnius, Lithuanian MP. We thank you very much indeed, Isabel Hilton and Stephen Chan, for joining us with your knowledge of the international implications of all of this. But most of all, we thank you wherever you happen to be watching this edition of Roundtable for doing just that. From me, David Foster, and the Roundtable team, until next time, goodbye.